So thank you so much for joining me, Sue Pritchard, Chief Executive of the Food Farming Countryside Commission, in conversation with Jyoti Fernandes from the Landworkers Alliance as part of our Trade Unwrapped series, Food Farming Countryside Commission project, which is designed to explore what matters to us in the UK as we build new trading relationships around the world. Jyoti, it's a brilliant time to be talking to you today, because this weekend feels to me like everything has changed with the results of the US elections. Should we just start out with a quick a reflection of how we think that's going to impact our trade conversations from here on in? What are your thoughts on that result?
Well, what's interesting is that, yeah, absolutely 100% against Donald Trump. But I did think there was some interesting ideas that he was promoting in terms of the idea of protecting domestic industries. And that is something in America that he was doing, was actually protecting domestic industries against being undercut by other countries and imports from other countries. And in a way, that is where he got quite a big base of support from a lot of the workers in industrial factories in America that felt they were being undercut by cheaper imports from China and places like that. Now, I don't know if that's very logical, but it is something that was there. But, you know, the way that he was promoting the exports from American agribusiness and wanting to push them all over the world so that he could get the vote of the American farmers was incredibly destructive. And here in the UK, you know, we need to be very, very careful that we don't let those agribusinesses that have really destroyed small and family farms in America, you know, here to impact small and family farms here. And, you know, he was trying to rush through a trade deal very, very quickly with India that farmers were protesting against, you know, in the streets, you know, on railway lines, everywhere, you know, mass protests against the trade deal with Trump, because when those American agribusinesses are able to sell things very cheaply, it directly impacts the livelihood of small-scale farmers here or anywhere else in the world. And that's what we're about. It's not about trying to stop, you know, imports, and it's not trying to stop imports from very good farms or smaller family farms, but it's about trying to stop those large agribusinesses that have very poor standards taking over and out competing price-wise the produce of small and family farms that's produced really well.
Just sticking with the US for a moment longer, because of course I've been riveted by it all weekend. It's been really interesting to see the stance that Kamala Harris has taken around food and agriculture. I think I'm right in saying that she was the candidate in the primaries. She was the candidate that was backed by the US Farm Workers Union, because she's been standing up for food justice and farm workers' rights for some considerable time in California and nationally. So I think that there's a really interesting conversation now to be had, isn't there, in the relationship between protecting domestic production in the right way, whilst also facilitating international cooperation, both in trade, but also on climate and nature, on things that really, really matter. So it's going to be an interesting pivot, I think, to see the extent to which, you know, attention to domestic production that Kamala Harris has obviously been advocating, as are you, I know, might change the shape of the conversation.
Well, what we promote as an organization globally, the Landworkers Alliance is a part of a farmers union that represents 200 million farmers across the world. It is the concept of food sovereignty, that people who are farming and countries and communities have the right to have the access to land and the resources that they need to provide food for themselves and their own communities first. That they should be able to have control over those resources so that, you know, they're not like unduly impacted by, you know, business interests that, you know, might affect the quality of their soil, or, you know, companies that are trying to take land in order to export loads of crops or whatever it is. So we work together with farmers in an incredibly global union, you know, representing 200 million farmers who want want the global trade system to reflect the idea that countries should produce first for themselves and their food security, providing food for everyone equally, so that everyone has access to healthy, affordable food, not like so rich people can afford really good food and people can't afford very much get really cheap, you know, imported, dumped exports, or, you know, stuff from food banks or whatever it is. You know, that food sovereignty has to be respected first before we think about having a global trade system and big companies making loads of profit off of trading commodities, you know, looking at luxuries before real good food production, you know, that's healthy and nutritious and biodiverse, you know, for local communities. So, you know, in general, we're looking at that, and also respecting farm workers' rights, you know, that, you know, the people that work in our food system across the world, primarily Black and brown farmers and farm workers around the world, are heavily impacted by an industrial food system. And, it, you know, with global sourcing, you know, when you talk about comparative advantage, well, comparative advantage has a fundamental flaw, is that often that advantage is taking advantage of low workers' rights standards, it's taking advantage of poor protection for the environment, or it's taking advantage of, yeah, just, you know, and poor animal welfare standards, or very, very intensive farming practices. And if that's what's giving countries the competitive advantage or the comparative advantage in the global trade system, then we don't want to facilitate that. We have to think first about how we guarantee protection of the environment, make sure everybody is treated fairly, whether it's the farmer that owns the land, an independent small and family farmer, or the farm workers first, and that make sure everybody is fed good quality food and the resources of every country are guaranteed for that first before we start global trading. And that's where we think that we need to reform the trade rules, really, so that that's a possibility. You know, it's not against trade. Every country can trade things and bring in income to farmers, but first we need to make sure that we've got a really strong base on looking after our domestic security.
You and I are big fans, aren't we, of agroecology as a set of principles, as practices, but also as a social movement. And I think what you're describing there, Jyoti, is all of the components of the agroecological principles, which pay as much attention to the social and economic practices as it does to regenerative agricultural practices. Do you think we can be more hopeful now that that movement to agroecology is gaining strength and impetus?
I think it certainly is. You know, I mean, really, agroecology was what fed the planet before we started the globalized trade system around the 1950s, 60s, and that model started to dominate. You know, people used what was in the natural environment around them to produce very biodiverse agricultural systems, you know, and people ate what was around them and you know, provided good, healthy, nutritious, diverse diets from what was around them. It was sold in local markets, whether it's open air markets or through boxes or through local shops. And that was the way it was. And then we started trading things across the planet, thinking it was more efficient to specialize, to get an agriculture that was very much focused on monocultures of one crop that could be, you know, harvested all at the same time, and you could use all these inputs to grow it, and then, you know, pack it into boxes and ship it, often unripe if it's fruit, for example, or frozen if it's meat, or, you know, dried if it's milk, you know, to different parts of the planet. And a lot of that started to go into processing because it was an easier way to ship it. That fundamentally changed our diets, it changed people's relationship to food, and it changed the nature of our agroecological farming systems. It also meant that we started to get a lot more people needing to be involved in being farm workers, because through these very specialized systems, you need more workers on a unit. Now, on agroecology farms, you have a lot of workers, usually local workers or people within the family, or, you know, people that need employment, but it varies from year to year. It's not like these groups of seasonal workers that need to do and pick all one crop at the same time or plant it all at the same time. And so it's a very different nature of the work, and also the working conditions and the respect or the enjoyment of your job when you're involved in these kind of large monoculture farms that you know, have to do with the global economy. So, you know, all these things that can be provided by global trade, and you know what the advocates of more global trade and food security based on globalized food system say, all of those things can be provided through an agroecological farming system and a localized farm system. And then, you know, the extras that we need, those little luxuries on top, they can be exported and sent around the world. But, you know, agroecology can provide those on a basis where it's a part of a mixed farming system.
And I think it's really important, isn't it, to just emphasize in these discussions that agroecology is no longer, if it ever was, a kind of niche middle class artisan proposition, because in fact organizations as diverse as the European Union, the World Economic Forum, right around the world, the shift to agroecological farming systems is increasingly being seen as the nature-based solution to the triple challenge of climate, the climate crisis, the nature crisis, you know, the loss of biodiversity around the world, but also the public's health and well-being, and the extent to which we grow more of the really healthy fruit, veg, nuts, pulses, meat and dairy from sustainable sources that are actually really good for us and what we need more of. So I think what I get huge encouragement from at the moment is that increasingly that agroecology is not the niche solution. It is, you know, the tidal wave of proposition from all sorts of places and thinkers around the world. Do you notice that too?
Absolutely. I've been involved through La Via Campesina with the Committee on Food Security, and watched over the last 20 years the review of the globalized food system, the review of industrial agriculture, and you know, a lot of analysis that's been done to try and work out why we haven't solved hunger, even though we're producing more food now than we ever did before. You know, we produce loads more than we actually need in order to feed everyone on this planet a healthy, nutritious diet, yet we still have hungry people. So what happened there? Why is, you know, agriculture one of the main drivers of the biodiversity crisis? You know, why are all these pesticides causing such horrific damage? You know, how can our food system contribute to 30% of climate change? You know, these are big, huge problems, very, very serious problems that we have to reckon with. And they've tried to review, well, what's gone wrong? Why are we producing all this food and it's not actually tackling these very, very fundamental issues? There was a report called the ICED report that came out on the global level, and that started to turn the tide of that thinking. You know, people were used to, and thinking about, you know, well, bigger is better, this very high-tech stuff is so much better, you know, global trade has this image that it's like big and powerful and it can feed everyone. A lot of that's propagated by agribusiness and all the agribusiness companies that have lobbyists that can be at the Committee on Food Security. But as a social movement, like in our organization, La Via Campesina, working with the Indigenous Peoples Movement, the World Forum of Fisher People, the International Workers Union, we've been lobbying and saying, well, no, you need to see the other side of it, because actually the statistics still show that 70% of the global food supply is provided through, you know, global food security, not the global food supply, sorry. 70% of global food security, you know, the stuff that actually feeds people, is provided by small and family farms producing agroecologically and selling through localized markets. Whereas we have this huge amount of food that's being produced by the industrial food system out there that's actually causing quite a lot of damage. You know, and that 70% of global food security that's provided by these small and family farms around the world only uses 25 to 30% of the resources that are there for agriculture to provide that amount of food security. So it's a much more efficient way of actually feeding the world. And now that these studies are coming out that are actually validating that message that us as small and family farms know is the case, now you're starting to see policy moving in a different direction. You're seeing countries signing up to statements about agroecology, you know, a lot more research and development being put into it, a lot of treaties. And I think it will be on par with the understanding that has grown around climate change. You know, when people realize how vital this transition to agroecology is, I think that's just emerging now as these studies start to illustrate how important it is that we transition that model, both for global food security, to solve hunger, to solve the climate crisis, to solve the biodiversity crisis. It's up to people like ourselves, of course, to keep spreading that message and helping people understand that this is a very real thing. It's not about niche products. You know, 50% of the people on this planet are small-scale farmers, and in some way depend on a connection to the land and producing food. You know, this is huge, and this is basic global food security.
Yeah. So let's deal with that point that comes up over and over again, that that if we protect or advocate for higher standards in the UK, we're somehow disadvantaging producers from developing countries. Mm-hmm. I know that you disagree with that. Yeah. Just sum up the arguments that you make in contrast to that one.
Well, I mean, one thing, it really bothered me hearing that being put forward as one of the main arguments that Liz Truss was putting forward, because, you know, where is the voice of those developing countries, you know, in actually saying that for themselves? It really felt like it was a bit of an excuse. You know, well, the developing countries, how often do we hear from them? How often do we hear voices from the global south, and not just the elites in the global south that might benefit from this, you know, global trade thing, or whatever it is? How often do we actually hear that? So it felt like there wasn't much of a chance for some fight back there. Yeah, you know, let's use them as an excuse to not do this. And I thought that felt a bit unfair. But really, you know, because we work so much with producers across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia, we hear from them all the time about the reality of global trade and the impact on farm workers in the global south, and also small and family farms, people that produce for their domestic economy. Trying to produce food security for their local community. And that is who we represent. We want to bring forward their voice. And yeah, a lot of those countries and farmers organizations in those countries have been fighting for the WTO to recognize that all countries should have the right to protect their standards. If farmers want to produce in a way that's good for the environment, good for animals, and good for their own livelihoods, and for providing domestic food security, then they should have the right to be able to do that. And that's been a battle that's been going on at WTO level for a very, very long time. You know, countries have wanted to put rules into place so that if they don't want to get imports of milk that's been produced very industrially, for example, so that they can protect their own small-scale dairy producers, they want to be able to have the ability to do that. So if the UK were to actually take a stand and go, it's okay to protect standards, if the consumers in a country, you know, want to have food that is of a certain quality, if the people that care about animals want to have them protected, if people that want to, you know, protect small and family farms or whatever it is, say they want to do that, they should have the ability to do that. That's basic democracy. And, you know, the rights of some very big farms that want to, you know, gain extra profits by having lower tariffs so that they can import things, or the companies that might benefit from these agreements, they shouldn't be prioritized over the, you know, the majority of people who actually want something out of their trade system that reflects the fundamental values that they farm with and their basic livelihoods. Now, one thing that we've noticed through our analysis is that when European countries have higher standards for what can be imported into those countries, for the farmers in the global south who export, that is actually a benefit, because it means that they won't be subject to ever increasing lower standards, and the farm workers on our farms will be subject to better conditions. And so our farmers organizations advocate across the board. Farmers organizations in Africa, India, Latin America, they advocate for higher standards because it means that the conditions on those farms will be better and they can compete. You know, the farmers who produce well in those countries can compete and not be undercut by the farms that produce badly. In the Punjab, for example, we have a clear example of this, where you know, the EU banned a lot crops that had certain pesticides on them from coming into the EU. And, you know, we were a part of the EU at the time, so a part of this as well. And as a result, the Punjab the government there decided to ban 27 different pesticides, some of the most dangerous pesticides in the state, in order to maintain the export opportunities they've got, all that wonderful basmati rice that we eat, you know, so much with all our British curries. And you know, that protects our health because we don't get all those pesticides when we have a good curry at a curry house. and it protects the farm workers in India. You know, in 2017, 30,000 people died of pesticide poisoning, farm workers in India. So it's really important that we get those standards higher because it protects those farm workers from pesticide deaths. And a lot of those pesticide wash into the water courses, you know, and it affects human health downstream from the water. It also affects the biodiversity there. You know, if we're going to be serious about actually having an impact on the global environment and respecting workers' rights around the world, we have to force these standards up.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that's really encouraged me this year when I was giving evidence to the Citizens' Assembly on climate was how passionate those citizens were about not offshoring the impacts of our choices. They really do care about fairness, and not just fairness for the domestic market, the domestic producers and citizens, but for producers and citizens right around the world. People do care that our food and farming system is fair, and I think that's hugely encouraging. We're running out of time. This is awful. I could chat to you for ages, but I'm going to just ask you to finish up with some comments about trade policy. So if what we are trying to do now in the UK, in the changed world that we're now inhabiting after the US elections, is to demonstrate leadership in the world for climate, for nature, for public health and well-being, and a just transition to the kind of economy that we need for all of that, what would be your top 3 asks for a trade policy in support of that?
Well, I think having standards, when the Trade and Agriculture Commission starts to review each of the trade agreements that goes forward, we really need to look at the standards we're putting into place, make sure that they are high enough so that it can spiral, good practice in the rest of the world. Then we need to think about our development budget and what we're doing with that. And, if there are countries that would like to try and meet those standards and they're struggling with doing that, then we need to invest in helping countries to be able to meet those standards and pick up agroecological farming practices. Our development department needs to be investing in farmers learning about agroecology, how to reduce pesticide usage, how to look after the soil, how to improve animal welfare, all these things. And we need to be making that investment to make that possible. Whenever possible, we also need to think about supporting biodiversity in the places that we import products from. So, regenerating biodiverse mixed farming systems, so we're not just getting that very standardized monoculture imports where we're thinking about stuff imported from forest farming, from mixed farms where, they produce loads of crops for their local area, but then they have a few extra cash crops, growing some extra ginger or, a little bit of extra rice or a bit of coffee as part of a mixed farming system, and support the development of those cooperatives and make sure we're 100% behind fair prices for farmers in the global south, and that we're respecting workers' rights across the board, that is a red line. No slavery within the trade system, no exploitation, making sure that those are very, very clear trade rules. And the last ask, the third one, I'm slotting some extra ones in, is climate. Climate needs to be analyzed in every line-by-line part of a trade agreement. Is the transport that's involved in whatever we're importing worth it? Is it an equivalent food product? We need to cut out, importing things that we can actually produce here. We should not be importing, cheese or bacon or lamb or any of those things that we could produce here at all, and actually, making sure that we're building up our own domestic production. Is it something that, it's being shipped to us in the most sustainable manner, that's got the lowest emissions impact? Is it seasonal when it's coming in? And think about every aspect of climate through every line of our trade agreements.
Brilliant.
And build our trade system around that.
Brilliant. Jyoti Fernandes, thank you so much for joining me today. That was absolutely fascinating, and I think we're going to be coming back to these topics again and again and again in the Food Farming Countryside Commission. So I look forward to keeping in touch with you about all of that. Thank you.
Thank you.